I welcome my panelists. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll be discussing with my panelists here optimal management of extensive stage small cell carcinoma lung. This is a 35-year-old gentleman who presented in June 2020 with complaints of change in voice, which slowly progressed to aphonia, dysphonia. Comorbidities were none. Smoking history was there. Here, there was a visit to ENT, diagnosed with vocal cord palsy, and underwent scans. So, Sanjay, would you like to comment? What is your way of looking at this kind of patients? What is the investigation of choice in this kind of patients?
Hello. So he presented with change in voice, progressive, will slowly progress to dysphonia, smoking history. Probably I would, CT is done, brain, everything is done. Probably I would also look at doing a whole body PET CT in such case.
Dr. Pete?
Since we already have done a CT head and neck and chest, first is I would like to know the findings of this particular scan, and then
Okay.
probably go ahead.
Dr. Nemade, would you do PET scan? That's what is my question.
This particular point
okay.
of time.
Okay, see, the CT scan revealed that there was a small mild enhancing soft tissue with surrounding fibrosis in the left apical segment with multiple enlarged conglomerate necrotic nodes in the left hilar paratracheal paraesophageal region. The aortopulmonary window had a nodal mass compressing the left pulmonary artery. So now, what is your next step? What would you do? A biopsy, a scan?
Definitely biopsy first.
Definitely biopsy first.
Biopsy first. Okay. So this patient, based on the CT, was started on ATT, condition worsened, and he had a seizure. And there was a MRI brain done.
So it was like on empirically started on AKT.
Yeah, a physician had started empirically ATT thinking that it is tuberculosis. And then the patient worsened and then landed up after an MRI brain to the tertiary care.
So patient has been diagnosed in June until October. The AKT was on without any benefit.
Yeah, no investigation.
So that even if they start, they generally assess after 15 days to a month whether they are responding, improving. So
ideally, yes. Yeah, the patient worsened only because of this ATT and not doing a biopsy. So a biopsy should have been done that time. MRI brain showed that there was a 2 into 1.9 into 1.7 marginally enhancing intraaxial right temporal lesion with surrounding edema and there were multiple sub-centimeter sized bilateral temporal frontal parietal occipital lobe lesions. So now, Sanjay, what is your next concern?
Maybe we are just working on a diagnosis. Maybe I would suggest now a biopsy at least since it is not done. So probably look at the biopsy and could be knowing this, there's a mets in the brain. So we'll look out for the primary now. So I'd suggest a biopsy knowing there's something in the lung already.
Right. So necessary measures like whatever stabilization with steroids and all should be done and a biopsy should be ordered. So this is a repeat CT scan in October 20, which showed a SOL in the upper lobe with mediastinal extension, encasement of the pulmonary artery, mediastinal lymph node, and consolidation. And this is the PET scan. So biopsy was done, and biopsy did reveal that it was a small cell neuroendocrine carcinoma. Dr. Pete, do you routinely do this PDL1 in small cell carcinoma?
I've started doing it as of now, but say a year back, I never ordered PDL1 upfront.
Dr. Sanjay, any comments from your end? I know it is not your field. Dr. Nemade, any
Definitely, we
comments?
do PDL1 now. Now, once like 2 years back, probably no, but definitely now.
Anybody from the audience who is doing PDL1 routinely in small cell carcinoma lung? Or any comments? Okay, basically small cell carcinoma lung, you need not do PDL1. It is almost a high tumor burden always for most of these patients, though there were some studies where they did, especially the IM Power study 133, where they did this, and it did show a benefit, but you may or may not do it. It is not required or mandatory. So final diagnosis was T4N2M1. Patient had extensive stage small cell carcinoma lung with brain metastasis. Sanjay, my question to you. What would be
just a
your
quick,
sequencing of treatment?
just a quick comment on the initial PDL1. So what happens is that not only PDL1, but then this applies to almost all the tests in which we are fond of ordering a test in order to see whether a particular drug works or not. And PDL1 probably is not a foolproof test to select patients for or against immunotherapy also. That is always the
No, in
point that
small
stays in
cell-
mind.
In
For
small
in
cell,
any
there is no
disease.
such recommendation that you do a PDL1 to start a immunotherapy.
No, even for non-small cell also, we have drugs wherein we say that you need not do a
Non-small
PDL1.
cell is a totally different. See, the only place where you should do molecular sequencing in a small cell is patients who are non-smokers. So if you have a non-smoker, then you should order an NGS. The reason maybe this may be a mixed cellularity and you may have a non-small cell component, and this patient should be identified separately. This patient was a smoker. So you need not do a next generation sequencing or even finding out that, what were the mutations, the RB1 or P53, it really doesn't matter. It is not going to change anything for this kind of patient. Sanjay, my question to you is like, would you be considering this patient for radiation first or chemotherapy? I'll ask all the panelists one by one. Let's take your opinion. And then if anybody from the audience, what is your choice of treatment?
I would prefer, this is already extensive stage with a known brain metastasis. So I think I'll go with the whole brain RT first as my first treatment and then sequence it with chemotherapy, because my whole brain radiation would last as a palliative setting hardly for 10 days. So shouldn't be much time consuming. I know systemic is more important in this case, but again, the concept of blood-brain barrier and giving whole brain is actually preferred in these settings, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, this patient has presented with seizure, so it is a symptomatic brain metastasis. So definitely brain RT has to be given first. So I would definitely do whole brain RT followed by systemic.
Dr. Pete?
I agree with Bhushan. Symptomatic patients, RT first. Asymptomatic patients, I usually take it with a pinch of salt. If the asymptomatic patients have got excellent GC, then I would prefer to start off with chemotherapy first. If not, even in asymptomatic patients also, I would ask Bhushan to have a look at it.
Anybody has a difference of opinion from the floor? Okay, so patient, in this particular scenario, the patient did undergo, patient was started on chemotherapy in this particular setting, but this is a paper where they were looking at this multidisciplinary panel of European expert. Asymptomatic patient, you can start with chemotherapy alone. If patient asymptomatic with limited volume brain metastasis, higher preference was given to chemotherapy without whole brain RT. Symptomatic patients, whole brain RT followed by chemotherapy was recommended. And symptomatic patients with limited extent brain metastasis, some experts chose stereotactic radiotherapy over whole brain RT.
Not for this patient. This patient also has two other lesions.
No, not for this patient.
No,
This is just
but anyway, small cell, we all know they have multiple metastases. So I'm not very advocate of SBRT in particularly small cell lung cancer. It is very well proven in probably other malignancy with brain mets, but small cell, I would always overtreat patient because they are multiple always. If they recur, they generally have multiple mets.
So in this patient, yes, and these are the NCCN guidelines. So if you have an extensive stage with brain metastasis and patient is symptomatic, brain RT should be before systemic therapy unless there is an immediate systemic therapy indicated. And we all know that, in extensive stage small cell lung cancer, The outcomes are pretty poor. We have survival, which is quite limited, less than a year in most of the setting. So this patient received etoposide and cisplatin, and subsequently in post chemotherapy was started on radiotherapy, 30 grain 10 fraction. Sanjay, this is the protocol you would also agree to?
I would agree to, because considering the age, 30 grain 10 is definitely feasible, and hippocampal sparing is now in practice on most of the centers when we do it, when we know patient is young. But I'm not sure about boosting those lesions. Had it been quite close to, hippocampus, then my whole purpose of, whole brain with hippocampal sparing would be lost. I'll think of boosting in a very good prognosis patient, not in such patients.
Okay.
So small cell, this boosting has not shown much benefit, as he rightly said. So probably 30 grade twin fraction is enough. Obviously, there is no harm in doing boosting, but there is no advantage also doing it.
Okay. So basically, if you look at the chemotherapy protocols right now, we have preferred protocols like carboplatin AUC 5 day 1, etoposide 100 per meter square day 1, 2, 3, and atezolizumab. We have carbo etoposide and durvalumab 1500 milligram every 21 days into 4 cycles, followed by maintenance. And we have cisplatin etoposide durvalumab followed by maintenance. So these are the recommended regimens right now. So this patient received chemotherapy, and then durvalumab was added on cycle 3 of chemotherapy, and it was given 1500 milligram every monthly. Okay. See, the role of immunotherapy in small cell carcinoma is basically through an idea that it is always a TMB high. So there is always a very high expression. Chemotherapy induces this tumor cell kill, which releases the tumor antigen and creates an exposure to immune system. PD-L1 overexpression also leads to immune cell evasion and T cell inhibition. PD-L1 inhibition restores this tumor-specific T cell immunity, and this reversal of immune suppression leads to a deeper, more durable, and systemic anti-tumor effect. So adding immunotherapy upfront in patients with small cell has an advantage. IMpower 133 evaluates carboplatin etoposide with or without atezolizumab, and there are other studies. So my question to Dr. Pete, what is your drug of choice? Like patient was young, patient was fit, had brain metastasis, radiation has been given. Would you consider cisplatin etoposide with durvalumab or carboplatin etoposide with durvalumab or atezolizumab?
Younger patients are more fond of using cisplatin than carboplatin. So my choice would be probably cisplatin plus etoposide.
I would differ. I would give carboplatin etoposide because that is the common regime you can give with both atezolizumab plus durvalumab. And choice of to choose between atezolizumab and durvalumab, it's depending on financial. This thing, I think
Anybody
both are equal.
has a difference of opinion of using cisplatin versus carboplatin? Mehboob?
See, in this IMpower 133, they have not given the choice of using cisplatin. So you have to use carboplatin if you are using atezolizumab.
No. If you are
But
using,
if you are using the durvalumab, then you have a choice, either cisplatin.
no, but what is your choice?
My choice, younger patient, cisplatin first.
Okay. See, there was a study which was published in June 2020 by Dr. Azhar, and what he looked at was 2,600 patients were being looked at, and he found that there was no advantage of cisplatin whatsoever. So we are all inclined to use cisplatin, but there was no advantage of using cisplatin. In probably times when there were no immunotherapies, cisplatin may have scored, but with advent of immunotherapy, the use of cisplatin in small cell probably would decline. That is
I
what
would
is.
just like to add one comment on this. Like as you said, carboplatin has a better auto neuro. We all know that. But one thing which is sure, which is different from carbo and cisplatin is the pneumonitis. So if you are using with immunotherapy, carboplatin can cause more pneumonitis than cisplatin. So you have to be careful. This is also documented in that analysis that if you are using carboplatin along with immunotherapy, you have to watchful for pneumonitis. component.
What was the reason?
Because carboplatin causes more pneumonitis than cisplatin. That is the reason. It causes
means-
more pneumonitis.
Drug-induced.
Drug-induced pneumonitis.
Okay.
Is there a difference in brain penetration of cis versus carbo?
Yeah.
Difference in penetration inside the brain for a patient with brain metastasis.
No,
So
Very low.
cisplatin works a little more than carboplatin.
No,
It's just
probably.
because of better toxicity profile we use.
It's the toxicity profile which is different. And there was no difference in this last study. So, and recommendations are you can choose anything, whatever you're comfortable with, but it is personal or institutional choice. So IM power 133, the PFS and OS were significantly longer in atezolizumab arm. The hazard ratio was 0.77 and overall survival, again, the hazard ratio was 0.70. But the ORR, that is the CR plus PR, was almost equivalent in the placebo group and atezolizumab group. And this is the Caspian study, which was a phase 3 global randomized open label active controlled multi-center study, which was a 3-arm study to look at treatment naive extensive stage small cell carcinoma lung with performance 0 and 1. Symptomatic or stable brain mets were allowed. Life expectancy if it was more than 12 weeks. And they were randomized to 3 arms, durvalumab with investigational drug, which was CTLA-4 tremelimumab, 75 milligram per day, and EP for 4 cycles, followed by durvalumab or durvalumab EP every 3 weeks into 4 cycles, followed by durvalumab. And third arm was EP, which was allowed up to 6 cycles. So the investigational arms were only 4 cycles, and the other arm had possibility of using a PCI, which was not allowed in the durvalumab arm. So this was, and both cisplatin, carboplatin were allowed, and 25% of patients were almost receiving cisplatin. So if you look at the IM33 and Caspian, all patients were allowed. There were no biomarker selection. Untreated brain mets were excluded in IM33. PCI was allowed in Caspian. Only 10% of patients in IM33 received this. And PCI was allowed in experimental arm in around 10% of IM33, which was not allowed in Caspian. There were 6 cycles allowed in control arm, which were only 4 cycles in the IM33. And cisplatin was allowed in Caspian, and carboplatin was allowed in both. So there was some, this Caspian study was reflective of real world data, allowed more of cisplatin, carboplatin, allowed asymptomatic, untreated or treated brain metastasis, and allowed 6 cycles with PCI. So durvalumab was given at 1500 milligram, and the arm which was tremelimumab actually did not show an advantage. So CTLA-4 right now or ipilimumab right now in small cell lung cancer has not shown an advantage. So that drug still would require further investigation. And there was some group like the North American group which was showing detrimental effect with tremelimumab. Well, rest of the countries did show a benefit in that particular subset. Durvalumab 1500 with platinum etoposide 3 weekly, 4 cycles in initial treatment, followed by durvalumab every 4 weeks until progression as maintenance, and platinum was allowed as we discussed. OS was the primary final endpoint, and optional PCI was allowed in the control arm. So if you look at the Caspian study with brain metastasis or without brain metastasis, in both sides, it did work good. And in brain metastasis, there was a median OS of 12 months versus 8.8 months. And without brain metastasis also, it was 13 months versus 10.5 months. So what are the contraindication, Dr. Pete, for using immunotherapy?
I would say one of the only contraindications that I have usually understood is that the use of steroids versus no steroids. That is something that I always depend upon. Otherwise, I find these drugs to be simple to use as compared to chemotherapy.
Anything from your side, Dr. Nemade?
Autoimmune disorder, that is as usual the blanket contraindication for immunotherapy. And second would be financial, obviously.
Okay. Okay, so I agree that, if patient is on immunosuppressive treatments or patient is having an autoimmune disorder, this is the only contraindication. You don't have to do any test to start these drugs, and it can be started to almost everybody, provided they are willing to afford it. Caspian progression-free survival at end of 12 months was definitely better, 4.7 versus 12.7, 17.5, sorry. And the OS was also definitely better. As we see that 12 months and 18 months, their curves are getting separated out. And the Caspian forest plot shows that it has been showing a benefit to almost everybody, including brain metastasis, which was not seen in the atezolizumab study. So brain mets were the only patients where the benefit was not seen for atezolizumab. So in this particular patient, durvalumab, which was started, was probably the better choice of immunotherapy compared to atezolizumab, because atezolizumab did not show benefit in those kind of patients.
Just an addition, actually.
Yeah.
The only correction or only the better option would have been durvalumab from day one, basically, rather than continuing after
Yeah.
3 cycles. Because it has been shown that no immunotherapy has more advantage post only chemotherapy. Like no maintenance immunotherapy if you are not given a chemoimmunotherapy as a frontline treatment. So I don't know whether the data of 3 cycles followed by durvalumab will match with durvalumab from day one, because all the study has durvalumab from day one. So this is different from whatever
Yeah.
patient we are.
See, this is a
this
real
is-
life scenario where patients do not agree on day one, and you have to start something, and they may not have their financial things ready. So this is a situation which happens in day-to-day life. One has to start with whatever is available quickly, and probably it takes time for them to get convinced or arrange finances and then go ahead with the drug. So
My intention was just to whether it will result into same result that was.
that is always a
Obviously, we all
concern.
know that it's not easy.
But
to
it is
convince.
always better than nothing. And we all have seen that, immunotherapies in post-CTRT settings also have done better. So this patient probably had more antigens released before he started durvalumab. As we see, Caspian study did look at the duration of response was almost similar, but there was at 3 years, if you see, there was almost triple the number of patients which were sustaining the response, 5.8 versus 17.6. And this is something what we have started to see with immunotherapies, that the long-term outcomes of this patient, once they cross 2 years, starts getting stabilized most of the time. So this patient had received
So
when they.
can I make one comment?
Yeah.
Just an advice to those who have given durvalumab or for that matter any immunotherapy. If you see both the studies, first 6 months there is no advantage even in PFS. So don't just stop the treatment that it's not working. So it takes time, but once it responds for a longer duration, like all immunotherapy does. So until unless there is a clear-cut progression or criteria for progression, don't stop your treatment. Continue doing that. You may get result. Probably there is a significant, even at 2 years, it is now showing significant survival advantage.
Yeah, I agree. Even if you see a pseudo progression, don't give up. So it takes time for stabilization, and probably do not evaluate before 3 months if you are using immunotherapy. So don't be in hurry to find a response. The response basically would be seen by patient's well-being. So if a patient is doing well and your scan is not doing well, still you consider that the immunotherapy is working. So this is the follow-up PET scan after 3 cycles, and you see a significant clearing. And this is after 6 cycles of chemotherapy and 10 cycles of immunotherapy. So this is the conclusions of our present patient is durvalumab EP is the new standard of care for first-line treatment of extensive stage small cell lung cancer. First-line durvalumab EP has shown a sustained improvement in OS compared to the robust control arm, which is reflective of real-world scenario, allowing 6 cycles of cisplatin etoposide or carboplatin with use of PCI. Benefits of durvalumab and EP was observed across all subgroups, including brain metastasis. More than 22% patients on durvalumab EP were surviving even at 2 years, which showed a prolonged survival benefit. Durvalumab EP provided good response rate and demonstrated ongoing response at 2 years, 3 times more than EP arm alone. And durvalumab offers a convenient once a month dosaging in maintenance phase. The safety findings remain consistent with the known safety profile of durvalumab EP. Dr. Peti, how frequently do you see that there are toxicities with immunotherapy, and what are the common toxicities you are looking at when you're giving immunotherapies?
I've not used durvalumab, but I've used nivolumab and pembrolizumab quite oftenly. The commonest toxicity that I've noticed always is pneumonitis, is pneumonia. Other toxicities I've really not seen in practice.
Okay. See, there are a lot of toxicities listed. Some toxicities may be good, some toxicities may be bad. If you see a hypothyroidism, that may be a good toxicity. So which you generally would see between week 6 to week 10. And if you look at these patients, they may have nephritis, colitis, hypophysitis, and so many things. So endocrine evaluation may be a very important thing in this kind of patients. What do you do if you get a grade 1 toxicity of immunotherapy? Dr. Nemade?
No, there are only two toxicity which I generally look for any immunotherapy. One is pneumonitis, because they are CA lung patient. You need to differentiate pneumonitis versus disease progression, and it is quite a cumbersome and very irritating toxicity to handle. Second, and which is probably the most emergency toxicity, is adrenal crisis. We cannot miss adrenal crisis because that is an emergency. All other, like as you said, thyroid reduction, you can do colitis,
Yeah.
you do coccal blood, or you do, so it is easily manageable. But I feel pneumonitis and adrenal
No.
insufficiency
Colitis also can be
This
very
can be a
bad. In
problem.
fact,
Yes.
one of my patient lost most of his intestine because of colitis. So
And
this could be also very troublesome. 1% of patients do get this, but then they are really.
And for grade 1, I don't change obviously, but for grade 2 onwards, we have to be very watchful.
Okay. Dr. Pete, what is your plan? Supposing a patient gets a grade 3 toxicity or grade 4 toxicity out of immunotherapy, what do you do?
As I said, I have more experience of treating pneumonias only. So in grade 3, grade 4, I prefer to start off with steroids and probably no re-challenge.
Okay. Okay. See, basically, if it is a grade 1 toxicity, you just wait for a week and most of them would settle down. Grade 2, you may have to start steroids after a week if they are not settling down. In grade 3, grade 4, you may have to start steroids immediately and taper them off. And if they're not settling down, you may have to use drugs like IVIG, mycophenolate, or infliximab, whatever. So just, this is a thing which we must remember in immunotherapy, that we need to be careful with these toxicities. And if you get any of these things, we need to be quick. And because we have two radiation oncologists, my next question is, what is the role of thoracic radiotherapy in patients who have complete response or a good response with some residual in the thoracic area? Dr. Sanjay and then Dr.
See, in extensive stage disease, there is some evidence now of giving local RT to extensive, like you treat like a palliative, like probably 20 in 5 or 25 in 5 to that whole thoracic, this thing. There is obviously no benefit with OS, but there's some local control which is shown.
No, I disagree with you. There is a survival advantage with cranial RT, and you have to give cranial RT also as well as thoracic RT also. Dose is anywhere between 20 in 5 to 30 in 10, but there is a survival advantage. There are two studies which shows that if patient responds to chemotherapy as a partial response, then you should give thoracic RT. And if patient has not received RT because of asymptomatic brain mets, you should give prophylactic whole brain also.
What is the role of thoracic RT in patients who have received immunotherapy?
That is little because whatever these studies were there, they were
not having immuno in their study,
immunotherapy
so
that
they had
time.
only chemotherapy.
So the only problem with thoracic RT immunotherapy is pneumonitis. It is a big problem. If you give thoracic
I'll just take 2 minutes. See, basically, if you are looking at PCI, there are different groups saying that different opinions. The URTC group said that there is a benefit. The Japanese group, they monitor, they do not treat, and they treat only on recurrence. The Dutch group said that if the age is more than 60, that there may be a disadvantage because there may be a mental fogging. And thoracic RT, optimal sequencing or using thoracic RT in immunotherapy based is not clear. But if you want to use thoracic RT, then it can be used after your chemotherapy is over, just during starting of your maintenance immunotherapy. The studies are all mainly during pre-immunotherapy era, where the benefit of thoracic RT was there. But this benefit in during immunotherapy protocols are not very clear. So they are saying that you can use it in some select cases. Thank you. That's done. Any questions from the floor? Or any comments? Then I conclude this session. Thanks.
Thank you, Manish Jain sir, for moderating the session and in detail regarding the management of early stage lung cancer. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Sachin Higmire sir to present current role of anti-angiogenics in ovarian cancer in the era of PARP inhibitor. This is a sponsored session by Dr. Reddy's Laboratory.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just take another 15 minutes of yours. You can sleep down because there is no updates which are often discussed in many of our meetings. This is just a revision of what we have been knowing in last 6 to 8 years. So at the outset, I must thank Tushar for organizing this meeting and getting every one of us out of our laptops and giving us an opportunity to interact with each other in person. And so obviously, we are moving through an era of immune checkpoint inhibitors. We are moving in an era of the next generations of molecular biological tests and the next generation of molecular targeted agents. And obviously, PARP inhibitors, which have definitely changed the way we are managing our ovarian cancer patients. As we can note from almost 2014, so many different indications have been approved for use of PARP inhibitors in ovarian cancer. So the magnitude of benefit of PARP inhibitors in ovarian cancer is definitely very attractive. And we have been all the time discussing all these updates. But then, although it's very important to keep ourselves updated with all these recent advances, it will be equally important to revisit about certain not so new molecules or not so new therapies and find out how we can integrate the newer therapies as well as the ones which have been available to us even before or in last decade. So in next 10-15 minutes, we'll discuss or we'll revisit the role of anti-angiogenics, particularly bevacizumab in patients of ovarian cancer, and we'll try to understand how we can use these agents along with our newer PARP inhibitors. So we all know angiogenesis plays an important role in tumor cell proliferation, invasion, and metastasis. And blocking this angiogenesis with the help of VEGF inhibitors can definitely help us in tumor control and adding survival benefit to our patients in ovarian cancer. So almost 9,000 patients have been evaluated with various agents which are targeting angiogenesis. We can go through the list. And out of these, bevacizumab is the one which is proven to be clinically useful. So we will focus only on bevacizumab. So this is again, as I said, it's just a revision of what we have already been knowing. So we'll go with the worst of the scenarios in platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. We all know that a substantial number of patients, most of them they would respond to our first-line therapy, but there would be a substantial number of patients who would be upfront platinum-resistant, or subsequently, when we have treated these patients with multiple lines of therapies, we will come to a situation where patients are not responding to our chemotherapy, various lines of chemotherapy. So platinum resistant ovarian cancer is a common scenario at maybe at the beginning of the disease or eventually during the course. Unfortunately, the outcome of once the patient reaches a stage of platinum resistance, the outcome is poor, and we have hardly have any options to offer in these patients. We end up treating these patients with single agent chemotherapy. The response rates are less than 20%, and patients hardly live more than 1 year. So this was the landmark trial which added one more option to us apart from chemotherapy. So this was an Aurelia trial which included platinum-resistant ovarian cancer patients, and they were treated with chemotherapy or chemotherapy plus bevacizumab, which was given in a dose of 15 milligram per kilogram every 3 weeks. And the chemotherapy was as per the physician's discretion. So 3 cohorts were allowed. One was weekly paclitaxel, the other was topotecan, and the third one was single-agent PLD. These are the common drugs which would otherwise use in patients of platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. So this particular trial did meet its endpoint and did show that addition of bevacizumab to our chemotherapy backbone in platinum-resistant ovarian cancer does improve our median progression-free survival rates. It's almost doubled from 3.4 months to 6.7 months. Not only the PFS is improved, but overall responses are also improved from around 12.6% to 30.9%. Out of the 3 cohorts, that has been attractive is the combination of bevacizumab with weekly paclitaxel. So PFS is improved from 3.9 months to almost 10.4 months. So the hazard ratio is 0.46, and the responses were achieved to the tune of 51%. So in platinum-resistant situation, a combination of bevacizumab and weekly paclitaxel are reasonably well tolerated and will give better results than what can be achieved otherwise. So weekly paclitaxel and bevacizumab is an attractive option, especially in patients of platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. Another subset of patients where bevacizumab can give us a better results is patients who are troubled with ascites, recurrent ascites. Obviously, we know it's a difficult clinical situation to handle. Patients have to go through the pains of repeated ascitic tapping. But then in these patients, in this subset of patients, addition of bevacizumab helps us not only to improve the progression-free survival, but then it also reduces the need of subsequent paracentesis. So patients with ascites is one subset where bevacizumab can add to our for patients' betterment. So there are different exploratory analyses. As I mentioned, with weekly paclitaxel, patients did well. With ascites, patients did well with addition of bevacizumab. Secondly, patients who have been multiply treated and now have developed secondary resistance to platinum, possibly they will do better when bevacizumab is added. And as I was mentioning, although the overall trial did not have an overall survival benefit, obviously because subsequently patients did receive bevacizumab on progression, so there was a lot of crossover. So although overall survival was not improved, there was a significant PFS benefit, and with weekly paclitaxel, even the overall survival was better. So this was about platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. With the basis of this particular trial, the drug was approved in November 2014, and I'm very much attracted towards the combination of weekly paclitaxel and bevacizumab, and in patients with ascites. Even as single agents in these situations, bevacizumab does have some role, some responses, and in few patients, the clinical benefit response has been achieved in around 25 to 27% of patients. So platinum-resistant ovarian cancer is one situation where bevacizumab can definitely add to patient improvement. In platinum-sensitive recurrent ovarian cancer, we all know we have been talking about, now this is taken over by the PARP inhibitors. But then there were 2 studies. One was the OCEANS study, which included platinum-sensitive ovarian cancer patients, and they were treated with either gemcitabine carboplatin or in combination with bevacizumab. The dose in this particular trial was 15 milligram per kilogram every 3 weeks. Again, PFS is improved with addition of bevacizumab in platinum-sensitive ovarian cancer as well. Even at 6 years, almost double of patients are are living without any progression. And this has translated even at 12 years, where 9% only with chemotherapy alone, whereas 30% of patients treated with gemcitabine, carboplatin, and bevacizumab, they were maintained progression-free. Response rates are definitely improved by addition of bevacizumab with a tune of 78% versus 57%. So another trial, GOG 213, which used the same bevacizumab in combination with paclitaxel. We all know that paclitaxel is one important regime in patients with platinum-sensitive ovarian cancer, where we want to re-challenge with the same regime. So even we are re-challenging the same regime, addition of bevacizumab can help us to achieve a better progression-free survival, even better response rate, and there was a trend towards better overall survival. These two trials have already been discussed so many times, but what is new, which has been published in last year, 2020, is this particular METO16 trial, which has used bevacizumab beyond progression. In the sense, in the front line itself, the patient has received bevacizumab, now has developed recurrence in the platinum-sensitive phase. So do we have a role of continuing bevacizumab and changing our chemotherapy or re-challenging with the chemotherapy? So these patients were platinum-sensitive ovarian cancer patients who had received bevacizumab in the front line along with paclitaxel. And now they have recurred after an interval of more than 6 months. So these patients were treated with continuation of bevacizumab or re-addition of bevacizumab along with chemotherapy. So even in this situation, progression-free survival tends to be better with continuation of bevacizumab or re-challenging with bevacizumab as well. So with platinum-sensitive ovarian cancer, this particular bevacizumab was approved in December 2016. And what's most important is bevacizumab continues to work even beyond progression. So even if you have used bevacizumab in the frontline setting, or even if you have used bevacizumab in the platinum-sensitive ovarian situation, even in the subsequent lines, if we want to add bevacizumab, the benefit can be retained even beyond progression. And the last, obviously, is role of bevacizumab in the frontline patients. So the landmark trial was ICON 7 trial, which used paclitaxel carboplatin along with bevacizumab, which was given in a dose of 7.5 milligram per kilogram every 3 weeks, and it was given for almost 16 cycles. PFS better, I would say it's only a modestly better because it's only 2 months of betterment. But in particular subset of patients, particularly who are in stage 4 or who are suboptimally debulked, in these patients, addition of bevacizumab as frontline achieves a better PFS benefit as compared to the earlier stages or maybe second and third stage patients. So stage 4 patients who are not optimally debulked or where debulking surgery is not done, if such patients are treated with bevacizumab in combination with paclitaxel and carboplatin, there is improvement in PFS and even the overall survival tends to be better. The same was reflected in this particular GOG 218 study. Obviously, the dose was higher, 15 milligram per kilogram, and the patients were treated a bit longer. Patients received 22 cycles of bevacizumab. But the main important aspect of this particular trial, it had all very high-risk patients in the sense stage 3, majority were suboptimally debulked, and stage 4 patients. So again, in this particular patients, stage 4, suboptimally debulked or debulking not done, addition of bevacizumab does improve PFS and a trend towards overall survival benefit. As I mentioned earlier, in platinum-resistant ovarian cancer, same holds true even in frontline. Patients with ascites particularly benefit even more if they are treated with bevacizumab, not only in terms of PFS and OS, resolution of ascites is better if we are able to add bevacizumab. When we are talking about frontline setting, nowadays, obviously, PARP inhibitors have proven extensive or huge magnitude of benefit, particularly in patients who are BRCA mutation positive, either germline or somatic. But then if this is a POLA trial, which used olaparib plus bevacizumab in unselected patients, and addition of olaparib and bevacizumab had the same magnitude of benefit in terms of PFS and OS benefit. Idea is possibly bevacizumab, one is we can conclude it does not interfere or it does not add to the toxicity of PARP inhibitors, and there may be a synergistic role of bevacizumab along with PARP inhibitors. So bevacizumab in frontline has already been approved since 2018. I would say the benefit is modest if you take the whole group as such, but then if we select out our patients, particularly stage 4 patients, suboptimally debulked, or not, the surgery is not done, in these patients, bevacizumab combination in frontline is definitely a useful option. Adverse effects of bevacizumab, we all as medical oncologists have learned to manage these adverse effects. We all know these are the common side effects: hypertension, proteinuria, epistaxis. Most dreaded are the GI perforations and arterial and venous thromboembolism. So the best way to manage, there is no scope of dose reduction in bevacizumab. Either we have to postpone or avoid, but the best way to manage is to select our patients well. So patients with no history of bowel obstruction or malignant bowel involvement, prior bowel resections, inflammatory bowel disease, these are the ones where we don't want to use bevacizumab. There has to be an extra caution in these particular patients, and obviously uncontrolled hypertension or active bleeding at any other site, that should be a red alert for use of bevacizumab. So this is my last slide. PARP inhibitors, definitely, they are the talk of today's era. The magnitude of benefit is definitely remarkably very high, very impressive, but then the benefit will be restricted to a subset of patients who either would have somatic or germline BRCA or HR deficiency. For all others, we definitely have another option of bevacizumab. The benefit is modest, but in carefully selected patients, the benefit can be even more. The classical, I would say, patients with ascites, if they are in platinum resistant situation, patients with weekly paclitaxel, and in frontline patient, if patients have stage 4 or suboptimally debulked, these patients definitely can have a better outcome if we are able to use bevacizumab. So it's definitely a modest benefit, but then we have, if used judiciously, bevacizumab is an important option even in today's era of PARP inhibitors. Thank you.